September 1939. German tanks cross the Polish border. The world calls this the beginning. The world is wrong. While Europe watched Hitler, Asia was already burning. The official timeline is a Eurocentric illusion. It ignores a brutal reality that started years earlier in the vast eastern plains. This was not a border skirmish. It was a 14-year campaign of total conquest. 14 years. That is longer than the First and Second World Wars combined. Why was a conflict that claimed millions of lives scrubbed from Western textbooks? The answer lies in geopolitics. Silence was a tool. September 18, 1931. Mukdene. The night is silent in the Manchurian steppe. A section of the South Manchurian Railway lies unguarded. A dull thud of explosives breaks the quiet. Dust settles. The damage is microscopic. Only 1.5 meters of rail are twisted. A train passes over the spot minutes later, unharmed. But the explosion was enough. Japanese officers watch from the shadows. They do not wait for orders from Tokyo. They have their pretext. The Kwantung Army moves instantly. Footsteps heavy on the gravel. Bolts cycling in the dark. This tiny detonator ignited a continental massacre that the press chose to ignore. The Japanese Imperial Army launched a full-scale invasion. The meat grinder of a 14-year war began with a fracture. Only 5 feet of rail were damaged on the South Manchurian Railway. It was September 18, 1931. Near the city of Mukdene, a dull explosion broke the night. The damage was so slight that the morning trains didn't even slow down. But for the Kwantung Army, the mechanical state of the steel didn't matter. Japan had watched Manchuria for decades. To the strategists in Tokyo, this land was Lebensraum, vital space. It held the coal, the iron, and the fertile soil required for national survival. The scale of the target was massive. Manchuria alone was larger than France and a unified Germany combined. How could a single rail spark a conquest of this magnitude? China in 1931 was a fractured map. 2 decades after the dynastic collapse of 1912, the nation remained a patchwork of regional warlords. 2 rival forces fought for the wreckage: the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek and the Communist Party led by Mao Zedong. Internal bleeding made the country a perfect target. The Kwantung Army, the elite Japanese force stationed on the ground, didn't wait for permission. They ignored the civil government in Tokyo. Minutes after the blast, they accused Chinese saboteurs. Within 1 week, Japanese boots controlled almost the entire region. The military elite had hijacked the empire's foreign policy. Chiang Kai-shek faced a lethal choice. He was fighting communists, warlords, and now an empire. To prevent a total collapse, he made a calculated move. He ordered his troops to abandon the region without a fight. It was a strategic retreat that handed Japan a fortress. Chiang Kai-shek chose to withdraw. The retreat from Manchuria did not bring peace. It only moved the front line. The same provocation script that worked in Mukdene was cold-bloodedly repeated by the Japanese military on July 7, 1937, near the Marco Polo Bridge. Night fell over the Wanping fortress. A Japanese unit conducted unscheduled maneuvers. Suddenly, a report reached the command. 1 private was missing. The Japanese demanded immediate entry into the village to search Chinese quarters. The Chinese garrison refused. Was the missing soldier worth a massacre? The Japanese didn't wait for an answer. They opened fire. This was the trap. 1 missing private was the bureaucratic excuse for a pre-planned slaughter. While officers argued over the search, artillery was already unmasking its positions. The private eventually reappeared. He was found safe and sound, his dusty uniform the only sign of his brief absence. It didn't matter. The mechanism of total war was already in motion. Unlike in 1931, Chiang Kai-shek decided to stand his ground. The skirmish at the bridge transformed into an invasion of the entire country. From the outskirts of Beijing, the fire spread to the streets of Shanghai. Asia was now burning in a conflict that would last 8 years. This explosion happened exactly 785 days before Hitler invaded Poland. While Chinese troops retreated under the relentless rhythm of Japanese artillery, the League of Nations in Geneva issued hollow paper resolutions. The world watched a continent bleed. How did the international community respond to the occupation of a sovereign nation's vast territories? With diplomatic silence. The Lytton Commission spent an entire year drafting its report. By the time the ink dried in 1933, the Imperial Japanese Army had already digested the region. Inside the League of Nations chamber, delegates sat in heavy oak chairs. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and tobacco. Then came the verdict. The report condemned the aggression but offered no sanctions, no embargoes, no consequences. The Japanese delegation stood up. The sound of wood scraping against the floor echoed through the hall. A low murmur of voices rose from the gallery. They didn't argue. They simply walked out. Japan abandoned the organization, leaving a void where global order was supposed to exist. The stage was set for Manchukuo. To give their theft a face, the Japanese needed a ghost. They found him in the Forbidden City's shadows. Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, was installed as a puppet ruler. He was the figurehead on the prow of a pirate ship. He signed the decrees, but the Japanese Kempeitai held the pen. Western capitals stayed quiet. In Washington and London, diplomats viewed the slaughter as a regional incident. They were paralyzed by the Great Depression and the rising shadow of Berlin. This indifference served as a green light for expansion. The Japanese military realized a dark truth. Violence worked. Bodies piled up in distant fields, far from Western borders, while the world looked away. This diplomatic silence from Washington and London was bought with the fear of Soviet communism and lucrative trade contracts. Western calculation was simple. It was cold. Money and ideology outweighed Chinese blood. The United States retreated behind the wall of isolationism. Washington watched from a distance. Their eyes were on their own ledgers, not the Pacific. In the 1930s, American trade with Japan was massive. It dwarfed every financial interest they held in China. Scrap metal and oil flowed to Tokyo. The American economy needed the Japanese market. Principles were expensive. Silence was profitable. Britain and France had their own ghosts. They watched the borders of Germany. Hitler was rearming, and the shadow of the Great War still loomed over Europe. To London, Asia was a distant theater, a secondary problem. They chose to ignore the fire in the East to focus on the smoke in the West. Was there another reason for this paralysis? Yes, deeply rooted racial prejudice. Western elites viewed Asian conflicts as tribal and insignificant. They minimized the slaughter. To them, 1 million lives in Manchuria did not equal 1 life in Paris. The West also needed a guard dog. They feared the Bolshevik threat from the Soviet Union more than Japanese expansion. Japan was the bulwark, a disciplined imperial force standing against the red tide of communism. The choice was clear. They accepted the Japanese Empire as the lesser evil. Economic cynicism and political calculation were masked by the systematic blindness of the Western press. The headlines in 1935 were loud. Rome invaded Ethiopia, and the world watched. Front pages analyzed every move of the Italian army. But the invasion of Manchuria? It stayed in the shadows. Small columns, tucked between advertisements for soap and radio sets. In the heat of the Great Depression, American editors buried Chinese tragedies on page 10. To the west, Africa was a colonial neighbor. Asia was merely exotic, a distant problem with no global consequence. The press chose its empathy. It framed the slaughter in the East as a local incident, a minor border dispute. Even the creation of Manchukuo failed to trigger the alarm. Japan installed Puyi, the deposed last emperor, as a puppet. He was a figurehead for a stolen land, a silent actor in a scripted occupation. Journalists maintained a tone of forced neutrality. They omitted the brutality of the Japanese advance to focus on internal economic recovery. This structural silence disarmed public opinion. There was no pressure on governments, no outcry for the victims, no demand for sanctions. The media created a vacuum. Inside this void, the Japanese Empire tested its strength. They built a war machine while the world read about domestic stock prices. The threat was not hidden. It was simply ignored. The global silence acted as a perfect shroud. On July 30th, 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army seized Tianjin and Beijing. They didn't just march, they orchestrated a collapse. The High Command moved with surgical coldness. Veterans in steel helmets boarded transport trains. Engineers prepped demolition charges. The strategy was simple: capture the iron veins of the north. Japanese columns lunged for the railway junctions. Heavy artillery neutralized the city walls of Beijing in days. Thick black pillars of smoke rose over the central stations. The industrial heart of the region stopped beating. How fast can a civilization break? Beijing fell in less than 3 weeks. It was a pace that outstripped the future German blitzkrieg in France. The defenders were ghosts of the 19th century. Poorly trained militias faced tanks with bolt-action rifles. The gap was total. By the end of July, the imperial flag flew over the ancient capital and the port of Tianjin. Japan now held the keys to the Manchurian resource corridors. The mechanical precision of the army triggered a human landslide. Millions of people poured onto the dirt tracks. Families piled wooden carts with pots, blankets, and children. These carts soon blocked every major road leading south. The exodus turned into a bottleneck of despair. Nationalist transport systems vanished under the weight of the panic. Millions of refugees fled into the interior as the roads transformed into the next front line. Japanese armored columns pierced the interior, not because of their strength alone, but because the Chinese defense was a hollow shell. Chaos ruled the ranks. Coordination did not exist. Can a war be won when your own generals are fighting each other? Chiang Kai-shek tried. He faced a lethal paradox: stop the Japanese invaders or crush the internal communist threat. He chose to balance both. This split strategy turned the front lines into a disorganized meatball of retreating units. The technical gap was a chasm. Elite Japanese units operated like a clockwork machine of the 20th century. Opposite them, Chinese conscripts arrived at the front in straw sandals. Many lacked basic uniforms. Their rifles were Qing-era relics, prone to jamming or exploding in the shooter's hands. While Tokyo's factories churned out tanks and aircraft, Chinese soldiers lacked basic radio sets. Communication happened through runners or not at all. Strategic retreat frequently turned into a panicked rout. This internal rot left millions of civilians exposed to a predator that did not recognize the concept of mercy. By late 1937, the Nationalist Army had lost its best-trained officers and its industrial corps. Out of every 10 soldiers sent to the front, only one possessed a modern bolt-action rifle. Shanghai was the Pearl of the Orient, a neon-lit metropolis of international concessions, banks, and jazz clubs. By August 13, 1937, the music stopped. Chiang Kai-shek threw his elite divisions into the city to halt the internal collapse of his nation. He needed a symbol. He found a meat grinder. The attack began at the international concession. Localized skirmishes escalated in hours. Small units of Chinese soldiers moved through narrow alleys. Then the scale shifted. The Japanese Navy sent an urgent signal to the home islands: reinforcements. Soon, 300,000 imperial soldiers stood on the banks of the Huangpu River. For perspective, that is double the size of the Allied force that would land in Normandy years later. The sound of the river changed. It became a constant, low-frequency roar. Heavy naval guns on the Huangpu fired point-blank into the city districts. One shell could vaporize a block. Chiang Kai-shek committed his best. The 87th and 88th Divisions. These were his German-trained elites. They fought for every staircase. They turned apartments into bunkers. International observers watched from the safety of the foreign zones. They expected a collapse. They saw a slaughter. The technological gap was a wall of fire. Japanese bombers hovered over the city, dropping ton after ton of ordnance on residential neighborhoods. Smoke blotted out the sun. The metropole was being erased by industrial fire. By November, the resistance broke. The City of Lights was a landscape of charred timber and broken brick. 250,000 Chinese soldiers were dead or wounded. The devastation of Shanghai left 200,000 Chinese troops dead. This massive loss forced the Nationalist command into a desperate retreat, leaving the capital of Nanjing in a lethal logistic trap. Chiang Kai-shek knew the city was a graveyard in the making. He ordered the government to evacuate to Chongqing. The move to the mountainous interior was an act of total desperation. This new temporary capital sat deep in the rugged heart of the country, far from the reach of the Japanese Navy. But Nanjing was not abandoned yet. General Tang Shengzi stayed behind with a massive garrison. His orders were simple: slow the enemy down. The Japanese high command didn't just attack, they suffocated. By early December, the Imperial Army had tightened a noose around the city. They cut every rail line. They blocked every road. They patrolled every inch of the Yangtze River. Inside the city, the situation turned grim. Visual. Empty medical crates littered the floors of overcrowded field hospitals. Doctors had nothing left but bandages and hope. Supplies had run out weeks ago. The defense was a hollow shell. Exhausted soldiers fought with dry rifles. Ammunition became more valuable than gold. By December 13th, the final lines of defense simply crumbled. The Japanese army broke through the gates. When the gates of Nanjing finally gave way on December 13, 1937, the bloodbath in Shanghai still burned in the minds of the Japanese rank and file. They didn't just see a captured capital, they saw a chance for vengeance. How does a regular army transform into death squads? Through years of ultra-nationalistic propaganda. State ideology had stripped the Chinese of their humanity long before the first shot. To the Japanese soldier, the enemy was not a man. He was a racial inferior, a historical obstacle to be cleared. The troops entering the city were exhausted and bitter. They had crawled through the meat grinder of Shanghai. Losses there were catastrophic. Now the restraint was gone. Soldiers trampled nationalist propaganda leaflets into the city mud. They ignored the rules of war. There was no military police to stop them, no discipline to hold the line. The scale of the systematic slaughter that followed defies comprehension. Over 6 weeks, the casualty count in Nanjing eclipsed the combined deaths of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Between 200,000 and 300,000 people were systematically erased. General Iwane Matsui, commander of the Central China Area Army, issued only vague instructions regarding the protection of civilians. The propaganda logic turned every military-age male into a legitimate target. No trial, no status of prisoner of war. The Imperial Japanese Army viewed the Chinese as a historical enemy to be erased. Soldiers stripped off their uniforms. They traded rifles for peasant rags. Thousands tried to vanish into the city's crowds. The Japanese commanders saw this as a convenient excuse. Without an organized surrender, the hunt began. Patrols moved from house to house. They checked hands for rifle blisters. They checked shoulders for strap bruises. Anyone suspected of fighting was dragged into the street. The sorting happened in silence. Men were tied in long chains. They marched toward the outskirts, some toward mass pits, most toward the banks of the Yangtze River. The executions followed a grim logistics of scale. Machine gun crews took their positions. Officers unsheathed samurai swords to practice decapitation on the kneeling. The Shaguan port area became a factory of death. Between 50,000 and 70,000 prisoners were systematically liquidated in batches. Imagine the scale. This single location holds more dead than a modern Olympic stadium. The rhythm of the massacre was mechanical. Bursts of fire, the heavy splash of bodies hitting the Yangtze. Some were buried alive. Others were thrown into the current with stones lashed to their necks. The goal was simple: reduce the number of potential insurgents, paralyze the survivors with pure terror. Thousands of bodies drifted toward the sea or settled in the river mud. 20,000 women. That is the documented minimum from the post-war international tribunals. While the Yangtze River carried away the executed, a different kind of terror consumed the streets of Nanjing. The Japanese command did not just permit violence, they institutionalized it. Squads of soldiers turned the hunt for women into a logistical operation. They raided private homes. They dragged victims from international safety zones. The scale was mechanical. 20,000 cases in 6 weeks means 500 crimes every single day. Age offered no protection. The victims included girls as young as 7 and grandmothers over 70. The cruelty followed a specific pattern. Soldiers raped women in groups to break any remaining social fabric. They used bayonets to mutilate children and disemboweled pregnant women. Often, they forced families to watch the abuse before executing every witness. To organize the chaos, the military established comfort stations. These were army-run brothels where women were held as sex slaves for weeks under systematic guard. The depravity eventually threatened military discipline itself. In the ruins, some Japanese officers tried to regain control of their units. They nailed up handmade forbidden zone signs on certain buildings. Soldiers ignored the warnings. They tore the signs down or simply stepped over them to continue the raids. Officers resorted to physical patrols to block their own starving, frenzied troops from entering designated sectors. How do you hide a death factory? You call it a water purification station. In 1932, Shiro Ishii made a proposal to the Japanese High Command. He was a military doctor, charismatic and hungry for power. Ishii was no amateur. He was a graduate of prestigious Western universities, an expert in bacteriology and virology who saw the future in a petri dish. He argued that biological weapons would decide the next war. The High Command listened. Ishii got his funding. He built his nightmare on the outskirts of Harbin. Officially, it was a civil infrastructure project. In reality, it was Unit 731. The complex was massive, outstripping the size and autonomy of many small European cities. A double perimeter of electrified barbed wire ran for miles. Guard towers broke the skyline every few hundred yards. Inside, the architecture followed a cold industrial logic. Modern laboratories sat next to sterile operating rooms. Beyond them lay isolation cells and high-capacity crematoria. Chemical fumes hung heavy in the air. The sharp clinical scent of bleach and formaldehyde drifted across the compound. It served a dual purpose. It kept the labs sterile. It also masked the persistent stench of burning bodies from the chimneys. The facility functioned with mechanical precision. Its goal, the mass production of plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid. Ishii didn't want medicine. He wanted pathogens capable of wiping out entire armies without firing a single bullet. But a lab needs resources. In the ledgers of Unit 731, these resources were not chemicals or animals. The experimental material consisted of living Chinese peasants, political prisoners, pregnant women, and children. Inside the laboratories of Shiro Ishii, humans ceased to be people. They became raw material. In official reports, Japanese scientists used a specific term for their subjects: Maruda, log. The choice of words was methodical. Logs do not feel pain. Logs do not have families. This vocabulary stripped the victim of their humanity before the first incision. The experiments followed a cold industrial logic. Doctors focused heavily on frostbite. They forced a prisoner outside into the Manchurian winter. They submerged their arms in vats of ice water. The doctors waited. They watched for the exact moment ice crystals formed under the skin. Then came the verification. A technician struck the frozen limb with a heavy metal rod. A dull, hollow thud echoed through the testing grounds. If the sound was right, the limb was solid. The bones shattered like glass. Why study the limits of the human body with such brutality? These horrifying records on hypothermia survived the war. Decades later, medical journals cited these specific data sets. They omitted the source. Precision was the primary requirement. Yoshio Shinozuka, a technician at Unit 731, later recalled the vivisections. Doctors opened the chests of conscious victims. They did not use anesthesia. Any sedative would alter the physiological data. They needed to see the infection ravage the lungs and liver in real time. They tested everything: forced starvation, high-pressure chambers that caused eyes to pop from sockets, systematic rape to track the spread of syphilis from mother to child. In the cell blocks, The research turned to mass contagion. Technicians released plague-infested rats directly into the human pens. They watched through reinforced glass as the epidemic took hold of entire families. Infected blood began to circulate through the ventilation shafts of the prison block. By 1940, the pathogens had escaped the laboratories of Manchuria. They fell on the civilians of Ningbo. Why drop bags of grain on a starving city? The logic was cold. A hungry population will gather every fallen grain, unknowingly collecting their own death. Imperial planes crossed the coast. They released porcelain casings and simple burlap sacks. Inside were rice and wheat. But the grain served only as a carrier for millions of fleas infected with the bubonic plague. The ceramics shattered on impact. Clouds of parasites crawled into the cracks of the city streets. In Ningbo and Changde, thousands died within weeks. It was not just an attack, it was a calculated psychological terror. The network of death expanded. Unit 731 was only the nerve center. In Nanjing, Unit 1644 focused on large-scale production. In Beijing, Unit 1855 coordinated the logistics. They worked in a seamless grid, protected by the highest military seal. This was no clandestine rogue operation. It was a national academic crusade. Elite Japanese universities and hospitals funneled their best talent into these centers. Young doctors viewed the Manchurian labs as the ultimate proving ground for their careers. The imperial machine recruited them by the thousands. 16,000. China was a house divided. Before the first Japanese shell fell, the nation was already tearing itself apart. Two irreconcilable visions, two armies, one inevitable collision. While Japanese planes dropped plague-infested fleas on Chinese cities, a desperate pact emerged. September 1937, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong formally announced the Second United Front. The numbers dictated the logic. Chiang's nationalists held the cities from Nanjing. They commanded millions. Mao's communists were sidelined in the remote Shanxi province after the grueling Long March. To Chiang, the choice was mathematical. He focused his best divisions not on the border, but on internal liquidation. First, pacify the interior, then resist the foreigner. This strategy fueled brutal extermination campaigns. It pushed the communists into the mountains. But the math changed when the Japanese began the slaughter in Nanjing. Public rage boiled over. In December 1936, the Xi'an incident proved that even Chiang's own generals would no longer kill their brothers while invaders took their land. The alliance was born of necessity, not trust. Under the terms, the Communist Party formally subordinated itself to the Kuomintang. They promised a single fist against Tokyo. In reality, the alliance remained a hollow shell of mutual sabotage and secret agendas from the very first day. The alliance was a facade. While the Kuomintang demanded heavy artillery and transport aircraft from their allies, the Communists ignored conventional doctrine entirely. Two armies, two maps, two irreconcilable ways to bleed an invader. The Kuomintang clung to the cities. They dug into fortified lines and guarded the steel veins of the railways. They waited for Soviet tanks and American planes to level the playing field. To them, war was a clash of regulars. Mao and Peng Dehuai saw a different landscape. They saw the spaces between the cities. Their doctrine was born in the mud of the Long March. Small units, high mobility, hit and vanish. This wasn't just a military choice. It was a silent conquest of the countryside where the central government's shadow never reached. August 1940. The 100 Regiments offensive begins. Peng Dehuai gives the signal. Tens of thousands of guerrillas descend from the mountains under the cover of night. They reach the tracks. Sledgehammers hit spikes. Dynamite snaps iron rails. The explosion rocks the valley. An armored Japanese train groans, its wheels grinding against twisted steel before sliding into the ravine. The guerrillas don't wait for the dust to settle. They are already melting back into the tree line. By dawn, the hills are empty. The Japanese reached for their maps and found no targets. This asymmetry carried a lethal price. The Imperial Army could not catch the ghosts in the mountains, so they turned their bayonets toward the villages. Every cut rail led to a burned settlement. Every sabotaged bridge triggered a massacre of the nearest peasantry. The Communists gained territory and recruits from the survivors' rage. The Japanese gained ruins. The rural population took the full weight of the Iron Fist. While the Japanese retreated across the Pacific, the United Front remained a polite fiction. Behind the scenes, the struggle against Tokyo became secondary. The real war was yet to come. Instead of deploying American aid through Joseph Stilwell's mission against the Japanese, the Kuomintang began hiding weapons. Crates of rifles and ammunition sat in mountain warehouses. They weren't meant for the front. They were reserves for the day the Japanese left. How much did they hold back? Thousands of tons of supplies intended for the struggle against the Axis vanished into regional KMT stockpiles. Corruption and internal repression ate through the resources. Stilwell demanded action against the invaders. Chiang Kai-shek prioritized the elimination of his internal rivals. The Communists played the same game. They operated with surgical efficiency, but avoided frontal collisions with the Imperial Army. Mao's forces recruited, trained, and waited. They deliberately let the KMT absorb the impact of the most devastating Japanese offensives. These hidden rifles would fire their first shots years after the Japanese departure. The logic of the KMT was simple and cynical. Every Japanese victory against the Red Army was a gain for the nationalists. The Kuomintang leadership purposefully manipulated Japanese movements to bleed their communist allies white. Weapon stockpiles and mutual paranoia made a collision inevitable. By 1941, the facade of unity collapsed. In the mountains, the Communist Party built a state within a state. They seized land from landlords. They handed it to peasants. They formed people's councils and ran their own courts. This wasn't just reform, it was a slow-motion coup against the central government's legitimacy. Trust vanished. Both sides hid troop movements. They hoarded Allied intelligence. Chiang Kai-shek's government tightened the noose by blocking the Red Army's logistics. The KMT cut off all shipments of grain and medical kits to communist territory. They wanted the Red Army to starve before the Japanese reached them. Mao struck back with propaganda. His cadres labeled Chiang a corrupt puppet of the West. Nationalist morale began to rot from within. Then came January 1941, Southern Anhui. Nationalist troops took positions in the mountain passes. Below them, a column of the new Fourth Army moved through the gorges. The KMT opened fire. Hundreds of their own formal allies were cut down in the ravines. Mao called it an unforgivable betrayal. After the slaughter in Anhui, the Second United Front existed only on paper to deceive the Western Allies. Who became the main protector of the Chinese in Nanking? The director of Siemens and a member of the Nazi Party. While Chinese factions killed each other in the mountains, 3 square kilometers in the heart of the captured capital became the only refuge for 250,000 civilians. John Rabe stood at the gates. He was the local head of the Nazi Party. He wore a red swastika armband. The visual dissonance was absolute. A Nazi symbol functioned as a shield for Chinese refugees. Rabe stood before Japanese patrols. He used his status as an ally of Tokyo to bar their way. Inside the international safety zone, the density was staggering. 250,000 people packed into 3 square kilometers. It was more crowded than modern Manhattan. No infrastructure, no running water, just a sea of desperate people. Outside the perimeter, the city turned into a slaughterhouse. 50,000 killed in the first few days alone. The numbers represent a systematic erasure of life. Japanese soldiers organized decapitation contests. They kept records of the executions like sports trophies. A private first class decapitates 80. A corporal kills 105. They smiled for photos next to piles of heads. The sadism followed a grim logic of training. Officers threw infants into the air to test bayonet precision. Recruits used elderly men as live targets for thrusting drills. Rabe watched from his garden. He documented everything in his diary. He saw mass graves overflowing with the dead. He wrote reports that the Imperial Command ignored. The Japanese High Command shifted from execution to concealment. They realized the scale of the international scandal. Military police seized cameras from foreign correspondents. They expelled journalists who refused to stay silent. Units received orders to gather the evidence. Soldiers poured gasoline over mountains of corpses in the suburbs. They burned military logs and execution registries to ash. Japanese units systematically destroyed documents and bodies to erase the traces of the massacre. A peasant hides a bag of grain under the floorboards. He hears boots outside. If he feeds the communist guerrillas, the Kuomintang will hang him as a traitor. If he supplies the nationalists, the communists will execute him as a class enemy. The choice was impossible. Total distrust poisoned the countryside. Those unable to reach the safety zones in Nanjing became pawns in a deadlier game. Collaboration with one side meant a death sentence from the other. The central authority didn't just crumble, it evaporated. By August 1945, the landscape of China had changed forever. Manchuria became the ultimate prize. As the Japanese Empire collapsed, a race began. The Communist Party of China moved faster. They didn't just occupy land, they occupied the people. To the north, the Red Army handed seized Japanese arsenals directly to Mao's forces. The CPC had spent years building a massive network of local militias. While the nationalists fought conventional meat grinders, the communists grew deep roots in the soil. The Kuomintang had endured the bloodiest battles of the invasion, but the cost was total exhaustion. Endemic corruption rotted the officer corps from within. Support among the masses vanished. The government in Chongqing held the cities, but they had already lost the war for the villages. The regular army of the Kuomintang was a hollow shell. In August 1945, as the Red Army crossed the Manchurian border, the creators of biological weapons at Unit 731 began a frantic race against time. The order was clear: erase everything. Engineers planted dynamite in the foundations of the laboratory blocks. Soldiers tossed reams of medical archives into open fires. Thick, oily black smoke from the burning records of Unit 731 choked the air for days. They didn't just burn paper. Thousands of bodies were dragged from the frost-covered cells and thrown into mass graves or shoved into specially built furnaces. Shiro Ishii stood over the ruins and forced every officer to swear an oath of perpetual silence. The cover-up moved from the mud of Manchuria to the desks of Washington. In Germany, the United States was busy putting Nazi doctors on trial at Nuremberg for identical crimes. In Japan, the logic was different. The Cold War was starting. The arms race against the Soviets required data, no matter the cost. Washington offered Shiro Ishii and his inner circle a simple deal: total legal immunity in exchange for their experimental results. The contrast was absolute. While Nazi scientists climbed the gallows, the killers of Unit 731 returned to civilian life. They didn't hide in shadows. These men became heads of public hospitals, directors of pharmaceutical giants, and deans of prestigious universities. Dr. Masaji Kitano went on to lead a world-renowned medical laboratory. Shiro Ishii himself lived as a free man until his death in 1959. For decades, Tokyo maintained a wall of categorical denial. The truth only surfaced in the 1980s when elderly survivors and repentant participants began to speak. In 1997, a Japanese civil court finally acknowledged the crimes had occurred. The Japanese government still refuses to issue a formal apology or pay a single yen in compensation. Washington's deal with the doctors of Unit 731 set the tone for the entire Tokyo trial of 1946. Justice became a secondary concern. Political survival took its place. The tribunal lasted 2 years. General Matsui stood in the dock for the horrors of Nanjing. He was found guilty. He faced the gallows. But the courtroom had a blind spot. Prince Asaka had issued the actual orders to execute all prisoners of war. He was never indicted. His blood was royal. For the Americans, the emperor's family was a stabilizing force against communism. Immunity was the price of order. The trial ended in 1948. Many executioners simply walked free. Japan issued no formal apology. It never officially acknowledged the victim count. The tragedy became a weapon. Chiang Kai-shek used the atrocities to fuel a war of exhaustion. But the communists played a deeper game. They moved through the scorched villages of the East. A party cadre speaks to a group of ragged farmers. He points to their burned barns. He describes the Japanese as demons. The peasants, traumatized by years of occupation, finally find a target for their rage. This rhetoric transformed suffering into a recruitment drive. It turned victims into a revolutionary army. The administration in the East collapsed entirely. Millions were left wandering the ruins. The final tally recorded 5 million displaced persons without a home. How do you turn an ally into a living shield? You grant them the status of a great power, but cut off the supply lines to their front. In November 1943, Franklin Roosevelt stood before the cameras in Cairo. Beside him sat Chiang Kai-shek. The American president declared China one of the 4 pillars of the New World, a global titan, and equal to Washington, London, and Moscow. The imagery was perfect. Propaganda posters of Chiang Kai-shek lined American streets. His wife, Sun Mei-ling, walked into the U.S. Capitol. Flashbulbs popped. Senators stood. Applause echoed through the hall as she spoke of shared sacrifice. It was a diplomatic masterpiece. It was also a lie. Behind the scenes, the reality was measured in fractions. China's share of American lend-lease was a rounding error. While mountains of steel flowed to Europe and the Soviet Union, China received less than 2% of total aid. Roosevelt saw a pillar. His generals saw a peripheral distraction. The contrast was lethal. In Europe, American boots hit the beaches by the hundreds of thousands. In China, there were no divisions, no mass landings, just symbols and speeches. Pearl Harbor had brought hope to Chongqing, but Washington's eyes remained fixed on the Rhine and the Pacific Islands. Military aid arrived in fragments, a few crates of rifles, a handful of planes. Every shipment was conditional, delayed, or diverted to higher priorities. China was expected to tie down 1 million Japanese soldiers with nothing but grit and American promises. The great power status was a decorative screen. Beneath it, the Chinese front withered from neglect. Planners in Washington continued to draft fragmented and conditional orders for minimal support. While Washington printed posters of Chiang Kai-shek, Winston Churchill spent the conferences in Casablanca and Yalta, drawing entirely different borders. London looked at China and saw a threat. Not a threat to the world, but a threat to the empire. British priorities were locked in stone. India, Burma, Hong Kong, Singapore. To the Foreign Office, a strong, unified China was a nightmare waiting to happen. If the Chinese won too convincingly, they would want their cities back. Specifically, they would want Hong Kong. How does an ally become an obstacle? The British fought the Axis, but they sabotaged the Chinese. In Burma, the strategy was simple: hold the colonies at all costs. Logistics for Chiang Kai-shek remained a secondary concern. When the Chinese begged for supplies to hold the line, London looked the other way. Every truck sent to Kunming was seen as a truck stolen from the defense of India. Coordination turned into conflict. British imperial troops and Chinese divisions operated in the same theater but lived in different worlds. Requests for air support went unanswered. Supply routes through the jungle remained choked. At the high-stakes tables of Tehran and Yalta, the pattern held firm. China's name appeared in the final communiques for the sake of optics. But when the time came to divide the actual steel and fuel of the Allied war machine, the maps of the British Empire always came first. China was excluded from every significant allocation of heavy resources. London's sabotage found its perfect mirror in Moscow. In April 1941, Joseph Stalin signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. It was a cold calculation. One signature froze the Eastern Front. Stalin needed a guarantee of peace in Asia to survive the German hammer in the West. The mechanism of Soviet aid was a double-edged blade. Since 1937, Moscow had funneled military hardware to the Kuomintang. Soviet tanks clattered through Chinese dust. Polikarpov fighters took to the skies over Shanghai. Technicians and advisors arrived in secret to bolster the defense of Nanjing. Did this aid come from friendship? No, it was a tactical leash. Stalin played both sides of the Chinese civil rift with surgical precision. Officially, he recognized Chiang Kai-shek as the legitimate leader. He needed the nationalist army to bleed the Japanese. Simultaneously, he maintained secret lines of communication with Mao Zedong. London's isolation and Moscow's double game gave American planners a free hand. They ignored the mainland. They looked at the ocean. Staff officers drew arrows on maps. The lines curved. They bypassed the Chinese coast. They pointed straight to the Philippines and Okinawa. Why waste blood on a continental quagmire? The smell of high-octane aviation fuel filled the island bases. This was a war of runways and hangars, not trenches and mud. The strategy had a name: island hopping. It was surgical. It was cold. By seizing key Pacific points, the United States turned the Japanese army in China into a ghost. Millions of occupation troops were cut off. They were still there, but they no longer mattered to Washington. Did the Allies care about the Chinese front? They said so in communiques. They lied. The priority was always Europe. Berlin was the heart of the machine. Tokyo was the limb. Chiang Kai-shek waited for a grand offensive. It never came. Planning for the landings at Leyte and the slaughter at Okinawa happened in rooms where China wasn't even a footnote. The goal was simple: total isolation, mass strategic bombing, a naval blockade that strangled every port. The final act didn't require a single American soldier to step into a Chinese rice paddy. It required 2 flashes of light over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This cold pragmatism had a price. It wasn't paid in Washington or London. By choosing to bypass the mainland, the Allies left the Chinese population alone with a cornered beast. Japan kept its most brutal, experienced divisions on the continent. With no Allied ground threat, these units functioned as a systematic meat grinder. They extracted resources, they burned villages, they stayed until the very end. This strategic choice forced China to endure the Japanese occupation for an additional 1,461 days. The maps in Washington showed arrows bypassing the mainland. Reality on the ground was different. By 1942, the grand strategy of the Allies had physically abandoned the Chinese interior. American help shrank to a single point on the map: Yunnan. Here, the first American volunteer group operated under nominal Chinese command. They were the Flying Tigers. Officially, these were retired pilots. In reality, they were the only shield against a total Japanese air monopoly. Tactically, they were elite. Strategically, they were a drop of water in a furnace. The geography of Asia became a silent executioner. When the Japanese seized Burma in 1942, the last land artery snapped. China was an island of stone. One route remained: the hump. The Himalayas became a graveyard for aluminum and flesh. Pilots flew unpressurized cockpits over the highest peaks on Earth. Ice formed a thick crust on the windshields inside the cabin. Oxygen was a luxury they didn't have. At those altitudes, the cold didn't just bite, it paralyzed. Without pressurization, a single mechanical failure meant a slow, freezing death. The Japanese didn't even need to intercept every flight. The mountains did the work for them. The cost of this logistics nightmare was absolute. Despite the propaganda of Allied unity, the physical bridge to Chongqing had collapsed. The promised thousands of tons of steel and powder turned into a trickle of crates. Only 2% of the total Lend-Lease supplies intended for China actually survived the flight over the peaks. The blood spilled on the hump route only fueled the mutual hatred between Chiang Kai-shek and General Joseph Stilwell. By 1942, the alliance had fractured into a war of egos. Washington demanded total control over Chinese divisions. Chongqing responded with a flat refusal. Who held the real power in this house? Stilwell controlled the Lend-Lease tap. He saw the Kuomintang as a pit of corruption. To him, Chiang Kai-shek was a leader without strategy. But for the Chinese, Stilwell was an arrogant intruder. He wanted to rebuild their army by American standards. Every nationalist commander saw this as a theft of sovereignty. The tension snapped in the jungles of Burma. Stilwell demanded Chinese blood for British interests. The Kuomintang hesitated. They watched the northern border. Mao's communists were waiting for the nationalists to bleed out against Japan. Resources were a zero-sum game. Every bullet sent to Burma was a bullet missing from the future civil war. The internal threat felt more lethal than the external one. By 1944, the stalemate became unbearable. Chiang Kai-shek issued an ultimatum to the White House. He demanded the general's immediate removal. Fearing a total collapse of the Chinese front, Roosevelt signed the order to recall Stilwell. Bureaucratic agony in the headquarters lasted until August 8, 1945. The Yalta Agreements were finally executed. The balance of power collapsed in a single day. Steel tracks crushed the border fences of Manchuria. Artillery dust choked the horizon. What happened to the industrial heart of the Japanese Empire? It was breached from the outside in a matter of hours. 1.5 million Red Army soldiers surged across the borders of Manchuria, Mongolia, and Korea. The roar of thousands of engines drowned out the wind. Operation August Storm began. This was not a slow tactical advance. It was a mechanical tidal wave. For 14 years, Tokyo treated Manchuria as its private fortress. The puppet state of Manchukuo was the lungs of the imperial machine. It breathed steel, coal, and chemicals. In 1931, they seized it. By 1945, they had turned it into a continental arsenal. Refineries worked around the clock. Mines stripped the earth for iron. Hidden complexes produced tons of chemical weapons for the front lines. In less than 24 hours, the Japanese lost the Showa steelworks and the massive chemical plants of Mukdene. Soviet mechanized columns tore toward Harbin. The once elite Kwantung army stood in their path, but the prestige was gone. By 1945, Tokyo had stripped the mainland of its veterans and best steel. The empire needed them to defend the home islands against the Americans. Those left behind were conscripts in thin uniforms holding outdated rifles. The Red Army moved with clinical speed. It was not a battle, it was a demolition. Heavy bombers flattened the perimeters while paratroopers dropped behind the lines. T-34 tanks bypassed strongpoints and cut the nerves of Japanese command. In less than 10 days, the imperial centers of Harbin, Mukden, and Changchun fell. The Japanese defense simply evaporated. 600,000 prisoners. The Soviets captured over 500,000 soldiers in days, not weeks. The scale of the collapse had no precedent in the history of the Imperial Army. Entire divisions laid down their arms before the smoke had even cleared from the initial artillery barrage. The victors loaded the captives into freight cars heading north. 600,000 men vanished into the labor camps of Siberia. Most would remain there for years in the freezing dark. While Soviet armor carved through the mainland, the American B-29 Enola Gay appeared in the skies over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. It carried a single weapon. The flash lasted a fraction of a second. In that moment, the city center simply ceased to exist. 70,000 people died instantly. At the hypocenter, temperatures hit several million degrees. Steel melted, stone vitrified. Humans didn't just die, they evaporated. On the concrete walls that remained standing, only dark carbonized shadows marked where people had been a second before. 3 days later, August 9th, a second detonation over Nagasaki. Another 40,000 immediate deaths. Thousands more began a slow, agonizing crawl toward the end, their bodies rotting from within due to radiation poisoning. Absolute power had been demonstrated. The Japanese high command sat in a state of clinical paralysis. How hot was the sun on Earth? The core of the explosion reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun, making every bunker and fortification irrelevant. Fanatics in the army still demanded national suicide over the humiliation of surrender. They preferred total extinction. But Emperor Hirohito saw the void. On August 15th, the crackle of radio static filled every home in Japan. For the first time in history, the public heard the emperor's voice. It was thin and trembling. He spoke of a new and cruel weapon. He spoke of enduring the unendurable to save the nation from literal erasure. Hirohito leaned toward the microphone to announce the unconditional surrender of the empire. The broadcast from Tokyo didn't reach the trenches instantly. When it did, the silence was deafening. Over 1 million Japanese soldiers remained stationed across mainland China. They held the pulse of the nation, the railways, the ports, the industrial heartlands. Suddenly, the chain of command snapped. How do you surrender 1 million men without a central authority? Panic replaced discipline. Japanese garrisons sat in fortified pockets, surrounded by a population they had brutalized for 8 years. No Western Allied divisions stood on Chinese soil to manage the collapse. There was only a vacuum, and a race to fill it. The Kuomintang struck first with a pen. Chiang Kai-shek issued a localized ultimatum. He demanded that every Japanese commander surrender exclusively to the National Revolutionary Army. It wasn't just military logic. It was a desperate grab for legitimacy. He needed to be the sole face of the new China. The communists had other plans. Mao's forces had spent years expanding through the north and northeast. They didn't wait for official proclamations. KMT couriers and communist detachments raced toward the same horizon. Both moved at a frantic pace toward the same massive weapons depots. The winner would inherit the firepower of a collapsed empire. Chiang Kai-shek ordered the Japanese to hold their positions and surrender only to his National Revolutionary Army. The race for the spoils replaced the war for survival. In Beijing and Shanghai, the surrender looked like a victory. In the countryside, it looked like a heist. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek issued a desperate order. Only his National Revolutionary Army could accept the Japanese surrender. The communists ignored him. Who would reach the arsenals first? The answer lay in the chaos of the provinces. In major hubs like Tianjin and Canton, Japanese commanders handed over their sabers in polished ceremonies. Sovereignty returned on paper. But in the remote borderlands, the mechanism of power fractured. Japanese units did not just wait for orders. Many simply dissolved. They abandoned their posts. They handed stockpiles of rifles and heavy artillery to local communist detachments. The strategy was simple. Grab the steel before the rival arrives. In 8 years, the occupation had stripped China to the bone. This was systematic plunder. The victors did not inherit a country. They inherited a graveyard of industry. Rail networks had collapsed. Cities were reduced to charcoal and dust. The economy did not just slow down, it ceased to exist. Retreating units ensured the vacuum remained lethal. They did not just leave, they sabotaged. Specialist teams spent their final hours burying biological canisters in the mud. They hid chemical triggers in the ruins. They sowed thousands of landmines across the path of the advancing Chinese factions. Bombs and chemical agents had turned the yellow earth into a toxic wasteland. In the agricultural heartlands, nothing grew. The soil was poisoned. August 1945. The news of the Japanese surrender hits the streets of free China like a shockwave. Despite the buried mines and the poisoned soil, Chongqing and Chengdu explode. Were these people celebrating peace, or just the end of one nightmare? The smell of gunpowder from festive fireworks hangs heavy in the air. It mixes with the acrid smoke of fresh skirmishes in the suburbs. In the city centers, millions wave flags. They weep for the dead who never saw this day. On the outskirts, former partisan units are already unholstering captured Arisaka rifles. They aren't pointing them at the Japanese anymore. They are pointing them at each other. Chiang Kai-shek stands before the microphones. He officially declares total victory over Japanese imperialism. Internationally, he is a titan, one of the Big Four, a savior of the civilized world. But the words ring hollow against the sound of distant mortar fire. The power vacuum is absolute. The Japanese are leaving, but they leave behind a physical and moral carcass. No one waited for a transition. not for a single day. Nationalist and communist factions move into the void instantly. They fight for every warehouse, every railway station, every abandoned Japanese pistol. 14 years of international conflict end with a signature. 4 years of fratricidal slaughter begin without a pause. The victory was a symbol. The reality was an exhausted nation sliding into a new abyss. Mao Zedong leads his forces toward a final confrontation that will reshape the globe. The struggle for the mainland reaches its climax. In 1949, the People's Republic of China is officially founded.